So, my name's Erik Bryn. I'm on the Ember.js core team. I'm curious, how many of you are actually, who's not using Ember here? Just raise your hand. Who's not? One guy. All right. Yeah. Two. All right. So, everybody else, mob that guy.
Sorry, man.
No, it's good. So, the good news is that I'm talking to a very safe crowd. I can basically get away with anything. I'm really lucky. I have to thank 1% Club for actually flying me out here, and I'm working with them this week, so that's why I'm here. So thanks to them. Alex also came out because I had a cool apartment in the Pipe to hang out with, and so did Igor, so if you haven't had a chance, talk to all three of us. It's kind of a rare occurrence, I think, for like 25% of the core team to be in one place at any one time. But so definitely, like, you know, assault us and ask all your questions because it's a really cool thing. So I'm really happy to be here in Amsterdam for the first time. I'll try not to say anything too ignorant, as I am an American tourist. So I've been making, like, the biggest mistake I've been making here, which is, like, I don't even know why I make the mistake, but, like, I obviously know that I'm in the Netherlands and that you guys are Dutch, right? But for some reason, Danish keeps sliding in, and I keep saying Danish, and I don't know why. But I'm really embarrassed. So hopefully I will not do anything while I'm trying to perhaps make some jokes and local references throughout my talk. I won't embarrass myself too much. So anyways, I'm here to talk about Ember 2.0. Who here does not know anything about Ember 2.0? All right, good. Even the guy that doesn't use Ember knows more about it. I'm here to talk about Ember 2.0, but first I want to reflect a little bit. And I want to talk about how we've gotten here. It's really interesting. You know, Ember 1.0, which I don't know how many of you, who used Ember 1.0? Like the very first Ember 1.0 release. Wow, okay, great. So we got a lot of old timers here in Amsterdam. So thank you, our longtime users. It's been a long, hard road, and Ember 1.0 was released in August of, by the way, these are American style dates, so this is month. This is year. I noticed that Alex pandered to the crowd and actually flipped his month and day on his title slide. He only forgot the zero. All right, well, so did I, but I don't need to. So anyways, funny enough, like Ember 1.0, this was like, I don't even know, Ember actually started 4 years ago, almost, to probably in like 2 weeks from now, I think, is my 4-year anniversary of my first commit to Ember. So it's like 2011 was when Ember started. And so our 1.0 took like a year and a half or 2 years or something like that. So it was a long, hard road to get to 1.0. And now, crazy enough, we're almost nearing 2 years in the 1X series. And so I just wanted to point out, you know, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into that, but it's been a great ride. And so, you know, obviously, Ember 1.0 was released back in 2013, but we've gone through a lot of versions of Ember since then, right? And so, you know, one of which that I'm really proud of, and that happened back in February. This is February 7th. Was HTML bars released in 1.10, and this one is ambiguous, but it doesn't matter. April 4th, 1.11 was released, which is what I call the Death to Mindabber release. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then most recently, Ember 1.12 was released on the 13th of May, and that's our current stable release. So I'm curious, how many of you are on 1.12? Raise your hand. All right, awesome. So how many of you are on 1.11 still? All right, what about 1.10? All right, who's still not on HTML bars yet? Raise your hand. All right, we need to talk. Come up and explain why in front of the crowd. Just kidding. So, on May 13th, Ember 1.12 was released, and also a very exciting release happened on the same day, which was Ember 1.13 Beta 1. And you know, if you're not super familiar with Ember 1.13, what was the big fancy feature that came?
Glimmer.
Glimmer.
Glimmer, right?
You didn't see it happen, but when it settled, it like kind of glimmered.
I think I kicked the cable or something. So what happened? So what's going on here? The interesting thing here that I want to point out, just in case people don't understand how Ember works, these two releases have the same date, right? It's May 13th for both of these. Why is that? Well, I want to talk a little bit about Ember's release cycle because I'm surprised sometimes when I talk to people, they don't quite understand how Ember's release cycle works, and so I want to just briefly touch on it. So we have 3 different release channels, and the silver Tomster on the right, on the left, is the release branch, and we've got Beta represented by the wooden Tomster, and then we've got Canary represented by the, I don't know, Tweety Bird, crazy bird Tomster. And so what's happening here is that Ember has a really interesting release cycle. These names might sound somewhat familiar to you, particularly the Canary release, because we focused our, or we've kind of stolen Google Chrome's release cycle and adopted it into the Ember ecosystem. And so basically, every 6 weeks, there's a new version, every 6 weeks-ish, there's a new version of Ember released. And so what that means is that every 6 weeks there's a new stable release, and then the branch, the beta releases turn into that stable release, right? So the idea is every 6 weeks beta turns into stable, and then master, or canary, turns into the new beta. And so how does this exactly work? Well, the short version of the story is that everything that comes into master, most things come into master directly. And so there's a little bit of a delay built in for new features to come into the code base and then end up in a stable release. At the minimum, we're likely talking about something like 6 to 12 weeks of baking time before something lands in Canary and then ends up in a stable release. And so one of the things that we do that I think is pretty clever is that new features are actually feature flagged. And so in Canary, you can have all of the newest and greatest features, and you opt in to use them. And then the core team basically is reviewing these things and trying them out in our own apps, and as well as the community. And if we think a feature is fully baked, then we turn it on by default. We call it going or no-going the feature for the beta cycle. And so before the beta branching occurs from master, we decide that a feature is ready or not. And if it's ready, we turn it on. We turn on that feature flag by default, and then the beta builds will include that code. Otherwise, if the feature is no-go'd, then, or we're waiting for it to bake further, the code will actually be in Canary. So the Canary releases are a bit larger because they include all of the code. That's all of the features, whether they're enabled by default or not. And then in beta, only the code that is enabled by default is in there. And so, and then after 6 weeks of a beta cycle, eventually it will turn into the stable release. And the idea with the betas is that we try to do them every week of the 6-week cycle, so that there's a new beta release that people can try in their applications and provide feedback to the core team. And so this is just a really short summary. There's a great blog post if you go to Ember.js.com/blog and you scroll down a while, you'll see it was actually something that we enacted immediately after our 1.0, kind of partially because it took us so long to get to 1.0, and we also spent a lot of time in the 1.0 release candidate phase. I think we probably spent a year in 1.0 release candidates or close to it. And so we kind of wanted to light a fire under our own asses a little bit, but we also wanted to bring predictability to the community, and also have, kind of avoid this problem typically around releases where it's like, oh, we want to get all this stuff in before the release, And so we're going to hold up the release if something's not done. And we do that kind of a little bit still, but it's usually more of a, the reason releases might not happen every 6 weeks are more usually because of time constraints, because we're all just an all-volunteer workforce trying to ship a pretty large open source project, and that takes time. But we found ourselves being less, doing less frequent releases, partially because there was always a reason to hold the release. And so when we have this next 6-week cycle and we communicate to our community that you should expect this from us, it allows us to set expectations and also plan better as a core team. And so I think we've had a really successful implementation of this strategy, this release cycle strategy since 1.0. And so I'm really happy about it. But it takes a lot of work. And so we have great guys like Robert Jackson on the core team that kind of bear a lot of the burden of doing releases. So make sure to buy him a beer next time you see him. And we've also done a lot of automation to make this possible as well. So anyways, that's the release cycle. So let's step back a little bit and talk about our last stable release. I just want to kind of review some of the features that have happened recently in Ember, just in case you haven't been paying attention. It's hard to keep up with all of the cool stuff that's happening. So in Ember, on May 4th, our prior stable release, Ember 1.11, we added a bunch of really great features. The first of which was the bound attribute syntax. And so basically this is the quote death to bind adder feature. And so this allows you to finally just use handlebars like you would expect to be able to with HTML, and it just works. Whereas before you had to use, in some cases, the bind adder helper, right? And so now that's gone. We have a nice complementary feature called inline ifs, so you can conditionally include, class names or other types of things inside of attribute values with inline if. We've added a much long requested feature of having an index value available when you're looping inside of a template. So the index is now the second block parameter argument that's passed in every iteration. And one of the name substates is kind of a more wonky feature. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but Google it if you're interested, or look at the blog posts. And then component helper was actually a really not that difficult feature to implement, but a really important one in hindsight. There is basically now a component helper that lets you kind of do a switch statement of sorts with component rendering. So if you had, like, let's say an array of polymorphic types, and you wanted to render a different component based on whatever type a current iteration was, the component helper makes it extremely simple to just have a simple loop that can render many different types of components depending on some data, right? And so that's really cool. You should check it out if you haven't already. Ember 1.12, like I said, was just recently released just about a week ago, and so that's our current stable release. 1.10 was a bit of not a super featureful release, but one of the great things that I want to touch on is the new computed syntax. How many of you have written a computed property that supports setting? All right, not many people. The syntax for doing so is quite obnoxious, and it involves like checking arguments length and stuff. We've got a nice new separated get and set syntax now in Ember 1.12. And so Ember 1.13, the first beta came out last week alongside of the stable 1.12 release. And on June 12th, we're scheduled for the Ember 1.13 stable release. So what's coming in 1.13? Well, we already touched on Glimmer. So the Glimmer rendering engine is now actually available inside of 1.13 beta 1. Also, with that came some really high-profile features, such as HTML style component invocation. We call this like angle bracket syntax. So instead of having to use curly's my dash component, you can now use just simple custom element HTML syntax, which is fantastic. Now, the interesting thing with this is that we've actually used this feature cleverly as a means of kind of changing some of the behavior around components that we thought was important for Ember 2.0. And so one of those things was one-way data flow. So now when you pass when you do bindings inside of a angle bracket-based component, it's actually getting a one-way binding by default. Instead of like the curly's-based syntax, it's a two-way binding by default. And so this is kind of part of our reactification of Ember. And really the short version of the story here is that we found that it was very easy with two-way binding to basically code yourself into a corner where you were relying on magic data propagation to occur between many different components in a network of components. Basically, you have a lot of data that's passed through a network of components, and any one of those components could change a value, and then that value change would propagate to everyone else, and then everybody else would have to react to it, and sometimes that change was undesirable, or you wanted to prevent it, and then you would have this kind of like fighting and struggle between components trying to bind to the same data, and they may not all agree on what that value should be. And it's also extremely hard to reason about what's happening when something like, you might inadvertently create a bug around this, and it's very difficult to reason about. And so we've decided that we want to do one-way data flow by default, and then have a more explicit data down, actions up style approach of how components can manipulate data. And that the general idea behind that is that a component can receive data in, and then if it wants to manipulate that data, it basically calls an action, and then one of its parent components can decide to handle that action and then do something with the new value that was produced. And so usually what that means is something as simple as, okay, when I instantiate my component, let's say I'm going to get, the name property in from somebody, and if my component cares about editing the name, then it's going to send maybe a name changed event up to somebody else, and then ideally it's going to send it to the parent that's responsible for producing that value to begin with, right? So there might be some component that was, perhaps doing some data fetching or what have you, or was responsible for that value initially, and we want to tell it that we want to change its value rather than change its value and then everybody else that cared have to respond based on that. So again, the idea is data down, an action gets fired up, and then it's up to that action handler to then mutate the value of name, and then that data will propagate nicely down the component hierarchy again. And so this architecture is heavily inspired by React, and one of the cool things is that it's enabled us to get a bunch of great performance optimizations with kind of stealing ideas and improving on some of the ideas in React's virtual DOM kind of breakthrough. And so we've got that now inside of Ember 1.13 with Glimmer, and it's really exciting. And so another thing that's kind of related to that, when you opt into using these angle bracket components now, rather than values that are passed in coming into your component as this.name, it's instead, or this.bar, or whatever basically that you're passing them in as, and those kind of getting mashed together with any state that might have already existed inside of your component, right? So let's say you have, in your component, you might have a computed property named name. But if you want to have a value passed in named name, now you have a conflict because they were both basically getting specified as, an instance property of that component, right? This.name. You couldn't differentiate between inputs and state. And so in 1.13, when you use this new syntax, all of your inputs actually come in as this.adders. And so this.adders.name would be the name that was passed in, and then this.name could be the state of your component. And so it's a nice kind of separation there, and it makes it clear to consumers of your component or fellow members of your team how data is getting into the component. Was it an input, or was it state that was managed by the component itself internally? And so along with that stuff came a whole bunch of component lifecycle hooks. I wish I had more time to kind of dig into some of those, but one of the coolest things about these new component hooks is that if you've ever written observers before to pay attention to when any of the inputs to your component have changed, and then like maybe do something with jQuery to like, you know, okay, the name has changed, and now I need to go tell my jQuery autocomplete plugin to update itself because it was displaying the name property, but I had to write an observer to kind of bind them together. Now there's going to be a nice coarse-grained hook, basically things like attrs. I'm probably gonna. Is it attrs did change? I think now. Basically, there's one hook where if any of the properties that are getting passed into your component change, that one hook will get called, that one method, and now you can choose to do things based on that, rather than having to set up fine-grained observers on every property that you might care about. So there's a lot of great blog posts that have been posted recently about Ember 1.13 and Glimmer and kind of the road to 2.0. You should definitely read those. They go into a little more detail here. And then of course, kind of the big sleeper feature here is routable components, which I've been working on in my spare time, and thankfully Edward Faulkner has recently offered to help me with because I've been so time constrained. Basically, we want to enable you to not have to write. I'm tired basically of answering the question, what's the difference between a view and a component, and what's the difference between a component and a controller. And so we've unified kind of the concepts. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but in Ember 2.0, controllers won't be a thing anymore. You'll still be able to use them via a plugin if you need them in your application in order to update. But the idea is if you're learning Ember from scratch from Ember 2.0, we want to have a newer, simpler programming model that's enabled by both Glimmer and also kind of the unification of concepts around components. And so that's coming in hopefully 1.13.1, which is going to, well, I'll talk more about this in a second. So Ember 2.0 is coming June 12th, the first beta of it. And so you'll notice, again, June 12th, stable 1.13, right? But on June 12th, beta 1 of Ember 2.0. And so let's talk a little bit about Ember 2.0 features. Oh, that's weird. Undefined is not a function. Not -1. What is that? Why? Whoever thought of that? So there are actually no features in Ember 2.0, which is a bit counterintuitive, but it's extremely clever. The idea.
While sipping his beer.
Yes. The idea is that we want you to upgrade to Ember 2.0, and we want you to not have to rewrite your application, right? So the idea is that Ember 2.0 is actually Ember 1.13 in disguise, or vice versa. Ember 1.13 is actually Ember 2.0 in disguise. Disguise, right? This is really, again, kind of, we've been messaging this phrase, stability without stagnation, and it's kind of one of the cornerstones in the core team's thinking about Ember. You know, we work on Ember because we want to have a community of people that want to have shared solutions to shared problems, right? And we don't want to fragment our community in our major, point releases. We don't want, like some others, to have big bang releases. We don't want to have long-lived branches. We don't want you to have to rewrite your application, and we definitely do not want you to be agile. You should not. I mean, actually, no. We want you to be agile. In fact, we've agiled your upgrade for you. And, you know, how does this work? How have we agiled our upgrades for you? Well, deprecations, that's how we've done it. And so, the way that it works is that in many of the point releases of Ember 1X, we deprecate the features that we're planning on killing in 2.0, right? And so you're getting some feedback along the upgrade cycles of what you shouldn't be doing anymore, right? And what we're doing is we're setting you up for the removal of these features in the next major point release, right? Ember tries to be a really good semantic versioning citizen. We try to do right by our users, and so you should not feel scared about upgrading from, Ember 1.5 to Ember 1.6 or Ember 1.7 or Ember 1.8, right? And likewise, we don't want you to be afraid of upgrading from Ember 1.13 to Ember 2.0. Because we don't want our community to be fragmented by the haves and the have-nots, right? We don't want you, too many of us have written apps in the past with popular open source frameworks that when you upgrade from the 1.0 or to the 2.0 or the 2.0 to the 3.0, you probably can't make that leap because too many things changed, right? And so what happens is that you probably have to support some older app, and then the new hotness is the new version, right? And what inevitably happens is that app that was never upgraded is severely neglected, or you're spending a disproportionate amount of time trying to do things on the old app that would be easier to do in the new app. And we don't want our community to have these kinds of problems. And the silly thing is that a lot of these problems are human-made problems, right? It's the problem that the project creates for your apps, right? Because we decided that, oh, we made some mistakes in 1.0, and so now we need to break your apps for 2.0 to rectify those mistakes. And so we think very hard about, we are very deliberate in what we do in Ember because we know that every new feature has a liability associated with it, right? And that liability is that you're going to start using that feature, and then if we decide it was a bad idea, now you're going to have to do work to potentially upgrade to a version that does not have that feature in it anymore. And so, there's inevitably, we're all human, we're all human, the core team is not comprised of programming gods. We're just as human as you are, and we're just as flawed as well. And so we make mistakes, and we've made mistakes along the progression of Ember's development. And what we want to do is, rather than paper over those mistakes and then try to rewrite the whole framework one day, we want to very easily guide you and not necessarily leave you behind. If you don't have the time to fix that code or rewrite that code, then you shouldn't be left behind ideally, right? We want to be able to bring you with us. And from a team of volunteers, there's only actually, I think now, recently, one person there's 12 people on the Ember core team, only one of us is actually paid full-time to work on Ember. And so it's an extreme labor of love, and it's amazing that we're able to do what we can, basically in our spare time, and be lucky to have, such a great, user base, and we're doing really well for an all-volunteer force against competitors that have paid full-time employees in the double digits working on it day to day. So I think we're doing well. But the story here is that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to need to remove things from the framework, and we want you to come along with us to future versions. And so we want the 1x to 2x jump to be very easy for you. I mean, it's not going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes along the way. But the cool thing is that you'll notice that I pointed out that there's going to be this Ember 1.13.1 release, right? So the idea is that we're going to actually keep incrementing. We're going to have additional minor point releases on Ember 1.13. So if there are problems with the upgrade to 2.0, there are going to be additional releases in the 1.13 series that will help bridge the gap potentially. So let's say there's some big bug in Ember 1.13, and it's fixed in Ember 2.0, but you can't upgrade easily without that bug being backported. We're committing to do that for you guys because we really truly want this upgrade to be simple. As simple as possible, within reason, of course, right? And so, let's talk about deprecations. So, 1.11, you've started, this was the first kind of, shot fired in the death of controllers. And so, object controller was deprecated in 1.11. So, I'm not going to talk a lot about these deprecations, but if you have questions, feel free to ask them at the end. So, object controller is gone in 1.11. In 1.12, we deprecated all the rest of the context shifting helpers. So basically, well, actually that was deprecated before. But we're basically what we did in 1.12 was deprecate the non-block params helpers. So things with like each foo as bar, that needs to be with foo as pipes bar. Each foo in foos needs to be each foo as foo, right? So those are pretty simple mechanical refactorings. And again, what we're trying to do with these deprecations and these upgrades is to keep the refactorings primarily to what we like to call mechanical refactorings, where it's like, they're probably simple enough that you could like write some code to do them for you. In fact, some people in the Ember community have some Ember add-ons that help make these leaps, and one of those I know of is Ember Watson, I think. So bind adder is deprecated because it doesn't mean, again, deprecations just mean we're going to complain that you're using them, but you can of course still use them, right? So you can upgrade to 112 even though your app might be using these features. But this is basically a warning saying you should probably think about how you could do it differently, because in 2.0 these features might be removed, right? And so array controller was the next shot, basically in the back of controllers. And another big notable one is that who can tell me the difference between this dot resource and this dot route inside of a router mapping definition? Not many people can. The word, yes. There's literally two names for almost the same thing. I think the official response is verb versus noun or something. I don't know. Anyways, we're getting rid of this dot resource in the router maps. You can just use this dot route almost the same way. And the pro tip there is that if you want, the one big difference is that resource kind of resets the naming. So you don't have to keep nesting your folders or nesting your link to names. There's actually been a parameter, which is apparently private API, but I believe now that I've stated it 2 or 3 times in a talk, it is now going to be grandfathered in as a public API. Reset namespace true. So you can just pass, like you can pass path, in as a second argument. You can pass reset namespace true, and then that will make this dot route behave exactly the same as this dot resource. So that's a simple, again, example of a mechanical refactoring. It really isn't very difficult to do that. Actually, some of these might not actually have been deprecated. I should have double-checked this. I gave this talk before it was released, and so I haven't actually double-checked. So I may be spreading some misinformation. But these are things that you should probably not be using anyways. Needs is another big one. If you're using needs a lot, you should look into Ember.inject. It's so much better than needs, and it's super simple to switch. And then another big one that you're probably using is array computed or reduce computed. Those macros aren't necessary anymore post Glimmer, because Glimmer has a really efficient array diffing mechanism. And so these computed macros were all about kind of being able to maintain the same instance of an array while doing many different transformations to it, so that the view layer would not would know that the view layer could observe all of the individual manipulations happening to that array. But now with Glimmer we can do a nice diff of arrays, so you don't need those things anymore. And in fact, we're just going to replace them with some very simple computed property macros. Yes.
So I heard staff say that some of the computed macros are going to disappear from the public API, like Ember.computed.source.
Yeah, it's possible, but they're going to be plugin. Most of these things that are highly used are going to become plugins. Okay, and so they'll just be an Ember add-on away, an Ember install away from being able to
use. And then we'll use a new Glimmer way of...
Potentially, yes. I mean, there'll probably be some that are like the old implementation, but if we want to prune away, there might be some that are rewritten that, serve the same purpose, but may not be included inside of Ember itself. So, and you're probably going to see that as a pattern. Now that we have basically standardized around Ember CLI, and that we have this great add-ons ecosystem, which recently just surpassed 1,000 add-ons now, written by the community. And Ember doesn't need to include all of the code anymore. It's one command line, command away from installing something inside of your Ember app. So I think we're going to probably want to be more careful about not including tons of features inside of Ember that could easily be done by an add-on. And then what that means is that we don't have to bet, that we got it right ourselves. We can let the community explore and play with new ideas as add-ons. And then if they, basically, if it's a really popular add-on, then what we can do is we can just have it be installed by default in Ember CLI. And it doesn't have to actually be a part of Ember itself. And so it's kind of, the way I think about it is that we're, with Ember CLI, we now can easily democratize all of the, the common code that you might need as an Ember app. We don't necessarily have to maintain it or write it, or it doesn't need to be a part of core. So, which of course means that we can reduce the size of core, and so if you want to if you care about file size or whatever, you'll have a reduced footprint as well. You can pick and choose easier. And so in 1.13, we've deprecated all of controllers now. And so again, there's going to be, I think we might not have totally finished that yet. We're still in the beta cycle. We're going to, I think, have it done by the end of the beta cycle. But the idea is that there's going to just be an Ember add-on that you can install, and it will disable the deprecation warnings in 1.13. And then in 2.0, the code won't be there anymore inside of Ember. But the cool thing is that the plugin will add the code in. So in 1.13, the plugin disables the deprecations, but in 2.0, it includes the code. So it's kind of like a clever thing that we can do with these kinds of deprecated features, where the plugins can disable the deprecations so they stop spewing, in your console or in your Ember inspector. But then in 2.0, they'll give you the code that you need to actually still use that feature, which is kind of cool. And so again, we want everybody to move towards angle bracket components. And so if you have an old style component, one of the things that we're trying to get you to do is if you have an older style curlies-based component or a mustache-based component, the idea is that you want to start using this.adders inside of it instead of this.foo, right? So all the inputs are actually, in old components, you can actually still access the inputs via this.adders like you can with the new style. And so we're going to start deprecating, if you don't use this.adders, you're going to get a deprecation message with your older components. So this is probably going to be one of the more noisier things that might happen in your upgrade to 1.13. But the nice thing is, of course, it's not going to break, but and it's really, really mechanical. It's going to complain about the property that you're using, and all you need to do is just add adders, in between this dot foo, right, and it'll go away. Some people are probably going to write add-ons again that do this kind of stuff for you. And so, then there's basically kind of this desire that, if there's anything else that we don't want to support until Ember 3.0, we ideally can, this is our, big major release that maybe for another year and a half or whatever, we're going to have to support. And, if there's things that we want to get rid of, 1.13 is our opportunity to do it before the jump to 2.0. But again, it's a delicate balance, right? Because we don't want to make it harder for you to upgrade, and we also don't want to that's the big balance is just like we don't want to make it hard to upgrade, but we also don't want to keep cruft around that we know we want to change either, right? So pragmatism. If you haven't read The Road to Ember 2.0, you should definitely read it. I should have added additional links. Like I said, go to the blog on Ember.js.com. There's a ton of awesome new blog posts that talk about Ember 2.0. But I think the important thing that I want you to take away from this talk today is that you don't have to wait for Ember 2.0. You're using it today, right? You're using features, some of the features, that, are already, all of the features of 2.0 are landing in 1x releases, right? And so, again, the upgrade to 2.0 should be fairly easy, and it's really just about, 2.0 is really just about removing cruft. and removing the concepts that we think make it harder to learn Ember and harder to use Ember, right? So I planned a little 2.0 feature scorecard. So let's see if I can actually, what the hell? I have no idea what just happened. Just decided to turn off. Alright, so let's look at this RFC real quick. Because I thought it was pretty interesting. This Road to Ember 2.0 RFC has been published since December 2014. And so in December 2014, we decided kind of as a core team, we met together, I think, in Chicago, and we were talking about what we wanted to do for 2.0, what our plans would be. And so we wrote up this RFC for the community to get feedback. And so if you kind of go through here, there's a lot to read. I definitely recommend reading if you haven't. I think, you know, a lot of like falling in love with Ember is really like getting to know our philosophy and realizing kind of how, you know, how much we care about building some, you know, a framework for the users, right? And so you should definitely pay attention and read this stuff. But here are some of the high-level bullet points that we planned. And so for 2.0, and so since December, more intuitive attribute bindings, that was what I referred to as depth to bind adder, that feature landed in Ember 1.11. So that's already there. The new HTML syntax for components, that just landed in 1.13 beta 1 last week. More block parameters for components, that landed in Ember 1.9. More consistent template scope, that's related to block parameters, that landed in 1.9. One-way data binding by default with opt-in mutable two-way bindings, that landed in 1.13 beta 1. More explicit communication, that's again kind of referring to the same thing, 1.13 beta 1. Route driving components instead of controllers and templates, that's landing hopefully in 1.13.1. And improved actions that are evoked inside components. Did this land in 1.13 beta 1? Sure. I can't remember if we turned it on by default or not. That's coming very soon. I think it's in 1.13 beta 1 now, the better action stuff. This is really cool. I didn't talk about it, but basically, if you're familiar with actions right now in components, like you pass a string, and then the component has to call send action with that name. Now they're just functions that get passed into adders. So this.adders.action name parens. That's how you call an action now. It's a lot conceptually simpler, and the cool thing about this is it makes it easier to pass actions as data to other components that might be a couple levels deeper. And so if you've ever had to deal with that kind of hole drilling where like you're passing an action down and then you're manually kind of bubbling it back up, this changes that and makes it a lot easier to kind of deal with these problems.
That answers my question.
What's that? Okay, cool. And so these are some of the high-level bullet points. We've already addressed almost all of them today, and Ember 2.0 isn't coming until June 12th, right?
July 24th.
What's that?
July 24th.
Well, that's the stable release,
yeah.
But the first beta is the date that we've been publicizing since EmberCon in March has been June 12th. So, but yeah, here's a couple things. Like again, remember this whole depth to bind adder. You can just do this now. It's fantastic. And you know, here's the again, if you weren't getting it from my verbal descriptions, here's angle bracket components instead of this. You can also do voids, so you can just put, you don't have to have the ended tag, you can just do kind of the XML syntax of just ending it. And block params, you know, so definitely review this if you haven't already and read the blog posts. But the thing I want you to take away is here's actually how you can do two-way binding still, the mute helper. So the idea is that you can just say, I want to pass down a mutable form of this property to my component, and then if the component wants to change it, there's a new, so in this case, my video component has a paused adder now, so it has this.adders.paused, and if it was not a mutable value, then this.adders.paused would just be whatever the value was, so like, let's say true or false here. Now if the component wants to change it, it actually, these mutable properties, these mutable adders have a different syntax, you actually can call .value on them. So you would do this.attrs.paused.value, and that would either be the true or false. And if you want to change it from the inside out, you can call .update, and that's just a method now on top of on that attr. And so it's a little more explicit feeling. But the cool thing about this is that those are basically mutable values that can be passed down the chain as well, right? They're kind of like first-class objects now. The mutable attributes are first-class objects that you can pass around the mutability of. And in fact, I don't know if we have this in here, but there's actually some really cool syntax where you can actually turn a mutable attr into an action just by wrapping the mute in action now. And so you can actually turn, you can very easily pass a mutable attribute into something as an action, and it will do kind of that boilerplate generation of like writing the action that would just call update for you, basically. So that's detailed in one of the blog posts, I believe, on Ember.js.com. So anyways, you're using it today. I should actually change the slide. You're using most of it today if you're on 1.13 beta 1. So I think we're doing pretty well on our feature scorecard. And Ember 2.0 hopefully will be coming to an MBM near you. And so let's talk a little bit, like preparing for 2.0. If it wasn't clear, the best way to prepare for using 2.0 is to upgrade to the last Ember 1X release, which is going to be 1.13, or any of the point release, minor point releases. And so controllers, I'm tired of this question. They're gone. Controllers kind of have this problem around the single responsibility principle, whereas like controllers were responsible for persistent state, but they were also responsible for kind of decorating. And so single responsibility principle, only neckbeards talk about it. I don't know who the hell this guy is, but that beard is out of control. And so again, they've been responsible for persistent app state. So what I mean by that is like when you left a route and you came back to it, the controller still had those same values that it had previously, right? Those persisted across kind of the controller's, throughout the controller's lifecycle, which was basically the whole app's lifecycle until somebody closed the tab or refreshed the browser. They also were responsible for decorating the data for the templates that they were related to. And then you had controllers that didn't necessarily have anything to do with the template, and they were kind of serving a purpose as a controller that multiple controllers could talk to and they could share data or whatever. It was very complicated to kind of explain this to new users. And so controllers' responsibilities are now split across components and services. So the way that I like to describe this is that some of the stuff you were doing, basically if you were decorating data for templates, guess what? All that code belongs in a component now. And if you were doing persistent, if you were relying upon having some kind of persistent application state, right, like having some properties that were there no matter whether the component was still rendered or whether you were on that route for the controller or whatever, that can live inside of a service now. And so it's a really easy refactoring. I've been doing a bit of this with clients already. Like, it's really, really simple. It's almost like a copy and paste job, basically. You look at a controller, you say, what's persistent, what's related to kind of persistent app state, and what's related to like decorating data for templates. And when you take it, you just take all that decorating stuff, you create a new component, you put it there, or you find the existing component that probably is kind of half doing that already, and you just put it there. You're done. That's the kind of mechanical refactoring. And then if you have persistent state, you just basically create a service named the same thing, and you can move all that stuff, those properties, over to that service now. And then what you can do is you can inject that service into any components that cared about that persistent state. And voila, you're done with your refactoring pretty much. And now we have we've kind of substituted, in a way, controllers for services now. But by doing so, we've eliminated the ambiguity of what the where you should be doing something, right? The answer to that question of like, what's the difference between a controller and a component, and when should I use one or the other? It was so infuriating because there was no good reason why you were doing it one or the other. It was really the reason was legacy. Components came pretty late in the Ember programming model, you know, really close to 1.0, and I think it was a smart bet that we made. Components have taken off, but we had this concept of controllers that stayed around, and you know, partially because we couldn't remove them because they were so important to the programming model. But it wasn't clear to us how we could have a unification. We didn't have the concept of services in our minds yet. And so now we've kind of come to a nice, I think, end game here with components and services rather than controllers. So again, services, these are kind of the new singletons that can contain application state. They're also injectable almost everywhere, which means that you can have a service injected into a route very easily with ember.inject.service. You can have it injected into a component. And it's also a nice little side channel where how you can kind of maybe connect multiple components to communicate with each other via the service. And so I like to think of services as bringing object-oriented programming to Ember. Like if you know, kind of can, if a lot of people have a struggle with Ember when they're learning it, like, I know what I generally want to do, but I don't know how to mesh that with Ember's way of solving problems. I think services are kind of like this nice escape valve where, like, if you can think in object-oriented programming, you could probably figure out a way to do it with a service very easily. A service with injections into components or routes or, you know, whatever. Or into other services as well. So they've been really great. They've worked well. Again, components are for decorating data and handling those events and actions for your templates. Views. They're replaced by components in 2.0. We're actually working right now on like trying to axe them out. But basically, I'm also tired of that same question of when should I use a view versus a component. The answer is once routable components get launched, there won't really be much of a reason to, other than, you know, some kind of simple, like, you know, components are kind of like isolated by default. So views kind of make it easy to not have to worry too much about passing data or actions or whatever through a hierarchy. But really, you know, we think that it's not worth it because views are kind of like, in a way, programming with globals almost. Or like, you know, because views didn't have explicit, you know, kind of data passing, your views, the success of whether, the answer to whether a view will work in any particular place is dependent upon the context in which that view is placed, right? Like if the view cares about some property existing, then that property needs to exist where you use that view, right? Because views can just go read values outside of their, outside of themselves, right? They can look up things on their context or in their, you know, on the controller or whatever. And so, whereas components, you have to explicitly pass them in, right? And so, it's kind of like, views I kind of think of as like a more sophisticated partial. So if you've used partials, you know, they're great because they let you take a big snippet of HTML and they let you like condense it to a one-liner and you can repeat that very easily across multiple parts of your application, right? Well, when you start putting curlies or actions or anything fancy inside of that partial, if you're not putting that partial in a place that has that data or that has that action available to it, it's not going to work. And you're not going to know it without having your mental model built around like the context in which you're placing every partial. You have to think really hard, like, is that data going to be here? Oh, yes, it will, because there's a component around it that exposes it, or it's part of this route that has its controller, that has its mix-in, that has those properties, and that's what the partial's referencing, right? Like, components are much simpler. It's like, does it have that property? Well, are we passing it in? No. All right. Is it state of that component itself? You know, look at the component's definition. Is it there? No. Well, then it's not going to work, right? Whereas before, kind of with views and partials, it's kind of like this, you know, kind of globals-based programming in a way, you know, but not totally accurate of a description. So, routable components, they're a work in progress. You know, there's a lot more to come. If you find there's pain points, you need to nag us. You know, we live in a slight bubble where like things are obvious to us because we talk about it and we live and breathe this stuff. But if there's something that you think we're missing or that needs to be better documented, please tell us. It's important. And so yeah, that's the story, folks. Thank you very much.